2, 1. Hello, my name is Kimberly Lewis, and I am going to talk a bit about building an authentic diversity strategy. So, as many of you are probably very well aware, many companies have been really taking a fresh look at their internal policies and external statements on diversity and inclusiveness in the past few months. And so I'm just going to give some tips and insights based upon the company statements and policies that we've looked at, and sort of compare and talk a little bit about what we see as best practices in this space. So I'll just start with where most companies are now. If you have a look at most large and most medium cap companies, they all do have some form of a diversity policy. Many of these diversity policies, and I'll call them sort of diversity policies 101, are sort of narratives of their broad statements that talk about their aspirations to be places where all employees feel valued regardless of their demographic characteristics. They may talk about different forms of diversity, gender. They will all have gender. Some will have ethnicity. Some will have sexual orientation. Some will talk about disabilities, religion. Some have cognitive diversity. And they all talk about wanting to create a space and have a workforce that is representative and inclusive. But what we're encouraging companies to do now is diversity 2.0. We see diversity 1.0 as essentially non-discrimination, right? And sort of broad, trying to encourage companies to get a lot more granular and specific about where those gaps in their companies are, what it's going to do about them, and have an action-oriented plan. So what does an action-oriented plan look like? Well, an action-oriented plan essentially has 5 key elements. One, after having collected data on its workforce and compared it to the workforce of the overall, depending on the region, obviously, and sector, the talent pool in the workforce, we encourage a company to set targets in those areas where it is underrepresented. Those targets should be specific and they should be time-bound. An example of specific is, for example, with ethnicity, it should break out where there are, for example, in the US, break out specific ethnic groups in the UK as well. We are now encouraging not to use BAME because there are very specific differences between Black and Asian communities and even within Asian communities. We're asking to get as specific as possible within these targets and identification of demographic groups. Secondly, measure progress alongside these targets and report on them regularly, whether it's quarterly or yearly. Now, because of gender pay gap, and some companies have other charters that is signed onto, it is already required to report regulatorily to comply with some legislation or regulatory requirements. But we also urge companies to do this in all of the areas that it has set targets beyond where it's necessarily regulatorily required to. We also encourage companies to publicize the results and the progress. This isn't so that we can judge or be critical, but actually when we see companies that are publicizing the results and progress, as investors, we're more interested actually in that the company is thinking about it and reviewing it and how they're getting there, as opposed to judging them if they don't necessarily meet a target one specific year. We want to know that they're ambitious, but also realistic. And we want to know the narrative around what the company is doing to try to get there. And lastly, we're looking for these to demonstrate clear accountability. Where does this sit? Who's ultimately responsible? Forward-thinking companies are also being creative. We encourage companies to strongly consider tying diversity and inclusion metrics into its both short-term and long-term compensation incentives. And in doing so, when putting together this policy, have an inclusive process. Depending on, notwithstanding where it's owned, it could be owned by a diversity officer, it could be owned by the HR function, it could be owned by the responsibility could sit in the executive leadership team, external consultants, specially designated group. But the information gathered as part of the process, specifically beyond the demographic data, but also indicators of inclusivity, should come through engagement surveys, interviewing a broad set of diverse stakeholders. That would be internal and external. As investors, we're often asked about our expectations on diversity for a company, and we're more than happy to give that. And also exit interviews. We're really interested in why employees leave, particularly good employees, and you can glean a lot of information about the culture and any specific inclusivity issues that should be considered taking action on. So the process of actually setting the strategy and the statements is a really good area to gauge a wide variety of opinions. So I want to give a specific example, and that's in taking a real critical look inward. So in setting these targets, as I mentioned earlier, you want to not just look at overall workforce numbers. You want to get granular and you want to get specific. Here's a good example of a company that actually, if you look at the overall percentage of both women and ethnic minorities in the overall workforce, it's actually quite high. But then the company drilled much deeper in its reporting, and the example that I showed is just one of many different statistics on data that it has reported. But it actually shows that notwithstanding the large overall number of, in this case, ethnic minorities in the workforce, when you look at where they sit, they're grossly overrepresented in lower levels of the organization and substantially underrepresented in the higher levels of the organization, leadership team, executive management team, and boards. What we would then expect this company to do, and in this case it has done, is set targets in these areas and report to them. So even though, so I think this is an example of a company that, actually has a lot of progress to make in terms of diverse representation in senior leadership. But we as investors would give them a lot of credit for capturing the data this way, reporting it this way, and being honest about the steps that it needs to take to get there and the progress that it still needs to make. And I want to give another example of a very different company. This is a consumer goods company, very popular one, but it's one that is known for taking bold statements on issues like social justice for years. So you can see that this is a screenshot actually from its website from nearly 5 years ago, where it was talking about Black Lives Matter. Obviously, this gives the company a lot of credibility now, 4 years later, and it can do bolder things with its external statements. They've actually incorporated, this company has incorporated sort of social justice actually in its products, as you can see from this, this ice cream that it is released. That's a very bold move and almost could be risky move, but for a company that has feels confident in its brand and its brand authenticity around, in this case, social justice, it gives it more latitude to take risky moves like this, and that can be very exciting. So another thing I wanted to talk about that's been in the news quite a lot, and that's the pipeline problem. There have been some high-profile instances of chief executives in various sectors making statements around their diversity challenges in their workforce being as a result of lack of talent, whether it's lack of eligible women or ethnic minorities. The thing I want to say about that is that if a company is going to talk about the pipeline problem, it should really have data to demonstrate this, and it should also show what it's doing to contribute to developing the workforce, I would suggest. It can be perceived as sort of a lazy way of kind of getting around dealing with issues of unconscious bias and systemic discrimination in the workforce to talk about a pipeline problem without data to support that. So we'll just encourage you as a company or as a sector that are talking about pipeline problems as the reason for lack of diversity within your organization, to really think carefully about whether or not there's evidence to show that, and whether or not you have a company are doing something about the pipeline problem itself. And lastly, I want to talk about this another phrase besides the pipeline problem, and that's a journey. A journey is a phrase that we see in a lot of corporate statements. Diversity and inclusion is very much a journey. Um, and in discussing this journey, as one company has done here, it can be a very powerful tool, particularly when you talk about what your company has done along this journey to advance diversity and inclusiveness. Um, but I also urge companies not to include words and phrases like this if it's not actually got demonstrated history of actually doing something on D&I for quite some time, or else it can feel like a bit of a trendy sort of statement. This one here sounds very authentic, and the company has real credibility in this area. But I just urge, when writing these statements and when reading these statements, to think about their authenticity and whether or not it really does reflect the journey that a company has been on. And if it's a new journey, it's perfectly fine to admit that you're just beginning. But the key to authenticity is really recognizing kind of where you are and communicating where you want to be. Thank you very much.